Welcome to Fashion, Really? The podcast for people who love fashion but hate pretty much all of the harmful things it does to people, animals, and the planet. Also for people who like a little bit of a goss on fashion and culture. That includes us. I'm Emma. This is Joshua. Joshua, how are you?
I'm great because I received a really fun little package in the mail, and I brought it with me
Show and
because
tell,
I
yay.
was just so excited that I got a sample of Sharinga
Sharinga,
bioleather,
yay.
especially after I saw the jacket that you were wearing, and I got kind of jealous
Now you can
and I
wear a
wanted
little
one.
square of fabric and pretend it's a jacket.
I can just
It's a hat for you.
It's
Amazing.
just a little yarmulke.
What are you wearing outside of your Sharinga bioleather tiny hat?
um Today I'm wearing a organic cotton moleskin moto jacket that is a Brave Gentleman jacket over a mesh football style shirt that I cut up and kind of made my own.
Hell
Found
yeah.
it at a thrift store. I'm wearing these fun little stripy pants that were Levi, um, I think they were samples or something, and I don't think they were ever actually made, but they ended up in one of the thrift stores near my apartment. I saw them on the rack and I was like, "Holy crap, I need those. They're really cool." And then I'm wearing shoes that are made from textile waste, these Brave Gentleman shoes that have a fun little neon yellow.
I'm really
Uh,
feeling for the people only listening to this and missing your acrobatics.
what are you wearing?
I am going a little bit pirate today with my look, I feel, because I've got a black lace top, long sleeve with a very big kind of frilly collar that feels
Ooh.
pirate-esque. And then I was given that back in my modeling days. And then I've layered it with a vest on top that is like a pinstriped denim vintage made in Mexico thing. And then on the bottom, I have an embroidered skirt that I also got when I was like 16. And I've been reflecting on the fact that I keep saying that every time I'm talking about my outfits. And it's making me realize that I was making good choices in terms of the style. That's
You're
great.
lucky that you saved a bunch of stuff
Mm.
from that time period in your life, because I got rid of almost my entire wardrobe after high
Oh
school,
no.
and I had this, like, I need to start fresh. I need to clean the slate. I'm gonna be my own person. I'm gonna go to college and I'm going to reinvent myself, because I had experienced a lot of bullying in high school, and I really attached that to my identity and wanting to be perceived in a new way and wanting to kind of reclaim
Mm.
how I was perceived. And I saw fashion as the way to do that in my 17-year-old brain, not really knowing much about sustainability in the fashion industry at that point. But now I think back to all the things that I had, and I so badly wish I still had them. So many great band t-shirts
Oh,
from
that is
bands that I
sad.
loved in the 1990s, and all my wide leg, like Jenko jeans and skateboarding pants and shoes. And it, it would have been a treasure trove.
Note to all future people who are probably not listening because I feel they're not. Don't throw out your high school clothes. Anyway,
Yeah.
should we talk about the news?
Yeah. What have you been paying attention to, or what's on the news radar?
One thing is Good On You has a new Fashion Planet benchmark report. They assessed 1,372 large brands and 4,032 small brands. And
I saw
basically,
that. Massive undertaking.
huge, so props to them. There's a massive difference basically between the level of fashion industry action taken to curb the climate crisis, halt biodiversity destruction, and pollution compared to the environmental reality of what actually needs to be done to ensure that we have a livable planet. So I think it's really important to remember in a fashion context that livable planet is one where fashion can continue to exist, let alone people can continue to exist. It's a
Yeah.
business existential problem, but it's broader, a general existential problem. Big brands scored on average just 30% and small brands 46% on how well they're meeting the environmental needs for action that were kind of assessed in this report. So, for example, in the article by friend Megan Doyle says even brands that have set emissions goals, emissions reduction targets, which 44% of the large brands had, they're not really having very much impact. 88% of those brands that do have targets don't disclose anything about if they're on track to meet them, and only 17% of those targets are actually science-based and aligned with the Paris Agreement. So this kind of shows that the industry still somehow isn't taking it seriously when it comes to emissions reduction, and are even less concerned with the nature-based impacts of operations like biodiversity and that kind
Mm.
of thing. One thing I thought was interesting too is I feel like circularity has very much become one of the words that industry like to talk about in terms of their action. Yet, despite the buzzword, most big brands don't actually have any circular schemes. Only 3% have a rental scheme, only 13% have any kind of resale scheme, and only 9% do take backs for charity donation. Actual recycling of textiles, particularly into new textiles, is basically non existent. And I
Wow.
honestly thought that that would be an area, at least, where there would be some improvement, don't you think?
Yeah. And this is a counterpoint to what we talked about last episode,
Mm,
where there was some good news around leadership and their keeping their commitments and seeing additional commitments. But this is more focused on fashion specifically. And this is less about just having the commitment and actually what they're
doing
committing
with
to and
it.
what they're actually doing. Yeah.
Yes. And it shows that fashion is really dragging behind like broader industry. Only 7% of the big brands measured their scope 3 emissions, which we've talked about before. That's where most of the emissions are coming from. So, chop, chop. 94% of the big brands also hadn't invested in low impact materials and material innovation, which is absurd. I think these
Yeah.
materials we need to start recognizing, like, even if they're not easy to implement straight away, they're exciting and they're a part of the future. And the ones that jump on board are going to be celebrated. My
Yeah.
kind of take from that is when is the point where we're just going to say we need to divest from those that are genuinely doing nothing so that we can better celebrate those that are, even if they're smaller steps? We need to encourage those steps so that we're emboldened to take bigger steps. I think that, we can't keep calling this industry creative or innovative or inspirational when we're sort of using the same tired tricks to extract profit and not thinking about creative, interesting ways to protect our planet, which is the most creative of all, I think.
Yeah.
What else have you heard?
Um, well, I heard that Adidas lost a greenwashing case.
Bull.
This is something we talked a little bit about on our last episode about greenwashing and lawsuits. And so the German court ruled that Adidas misled consumers with claims it would be climate neutral by 2050,
Mhm,
calling the pledge way too vague.
mhm.
So this sets a precedent for holding brands accountable for their sustainability marketing. But beyond Adidas, the court's decision, it is a red flag for all brands making vague or distant claim pledges. The bar for proof is not just promises, it's getting higher. So people can't just make a claim we're going to be carbon neutral by this date, or that you'll actually be held accountable to that. What are you doing to achieve that? How do you feel about that? Do you think that this kind of lawsuit is a good thing, or does it create, like we spoke about last time, a chilling effect?
For this one, for Adidas, it would depend on the information. If they were not able to provide a clear pathway to carbon neutral by 2050, if that wasn't being publicly shared, if they weren't hitting those targets towards it, then I think this is totally appropriate. Because otherwise, any brand can just say, oh, yeah, we're going to do this in like 25 years. You just wait and see. And they can gain trust based off of that. If they're not actually working towards it, then that absolutely is greenwashing. And we've
Mm,
talked a lot, even just before, about like setting targets are one thing. Are you actually going to meet them? I think
yeah.
also there's a lack of, and this is not just an issue with Adidas, but there's a lack of public understanding more broadly with consumers about like there's a like lack of understanding about what carbon neutral is, and that a brand could be saying that because they're going to just buy carbon offsets, but actually keep on emitting the same amount of emissions into the atmosphere, contribute to the climate crisis just as much. But
Yeah.
quote unquote, fix it somewhere else. So I wonder if that also played a part in this whole thing. What do you think?
I'd be curious. Let's keep an eye on that story as more details come out.
Mm.
I know that you're an avid reader.
Mm.
So, what did you read since the last time we met?
Last time I told you that I read something really boring that hopefully became less boring. This time I won't be saying that because I read a book that I loved. I'm also back on the train of telling you about a book that's not actually about fashion, but I'm going to make it about fashion. And that is my month's book club book that probably alongside like 5 million other book clubs around the world read Orbital by Samantha Harvey. It's also very controversial. The book club was heavily divided. I loved it. Each short chapter is like a different orbit around the Earth by a team of astronauts in the International Space Station. Side note, they are astronauts doing actual science, learning about climate elements that we need to understand. They're not just having a joyride. I feel like that's relevant to say lately. The writing is very floral, kind of meandering, and it really brought the humanist out in me, which I need a bit of that sometimes, because it's talking about
Mhm.
how, like, looking down at the same Earth for months, these astronauts first were amazed to see the lights that showed, like, where humanity is, but then they were amazed to see nature during the day where it seems like humanity is not there and wow, isn't the planet spectacular? But then over time, they realized that actually all this nature that they were seeing is so shaped by humanity and is so politically driven because they were seeing, cattle ranches in the Amazon or the Amazon burning or dried out rivers and lakes
Wow.
that used to be full, but the climate crisis has dried up, desertification. And I thought that was so interesting, like to really be able to realize what you're seeing is not what you first thought it was and how much we've changed the landscape. And I
Hmm.
guess it's made me been thinking, particularly with cattle ranching and leather, like there's clear ties there to fashion. Same with things drying up and the climate crisis and fashion's contribution. I find
Yeah.
it frustrating sometimes when we obviously need to put like the benefits of environmental action by the fashion industry into frameworks that are business relevant, like annual benchmarks and successes that can be shared, economic risks, benefits of acting on the climate crisis. These are important to business, but I feel like this perspective of this book would be one that if people in charge in fashion could see, would realize like fashion supply chains literally are changing the face of the earth. We can't see
Yeah.
money from space, we can't see clothing from space, and yet we can see the impact of what our, like, relentless drive for more of those is doing.
Wow, that's a powerful visual. What you just said, I think, is often what's lacking in people's ability to comprehend the scale of impacts.
Yeah.
And a long time ago, I read this book about referring to the climate crisis as a hyper object. And
Mm.
hyper objects are things that we know are real, but you can't just point at it. You can't just say, "Oh,
Yeah.
there's climate change. Oh, like there it is right over there." And because it's this hyper object that's real and it's physical and it exists, but you can't see it unless you're from outer space. And
Yeah.
so this is a really interesting way to look at the climate crisis as a bird's eye view of the actual planet.
Totally. And I think you know, it's another reminder sort of making fashion objects, hyper objects. And then also as a small side note, I listened to a Draper's Talk podcast where the assistant director from the UK's Competition and Markets Authority was explaining their new resources specific to the fashion industry about how to not get in trouble for greenwashing. They've never done that for any industry before. So if you're in fashion marketing, definitely listen. They have a new category that's about like fresh fits, which follows up their fashion fails. So it's like, here are green claims you shouldn't make, but here's how you could change them to actually be more accurate and backed up by data. So that's just a
Mm.
little call out that it's worth listening to if that's relevant to you.
Yeah, I'll definitely check that out.
And what about you? What have you been reading, listening to, watching?
I revisited one of my favorite books. It's called Art and Animals by Giovanni Aloy.
Two of my favorite things.
And Art and Animals. And it's a book that I read. It's not new, but it feels kind of timeless. It's
Mhm.
from 2012. I interviewed Giovanni many years ago when I wrote my blog, The Discerning Brew, and I interviewed him about animals as they appear as symbols in art. And I felt that there was this really strong connection between how animals show up in fashion as well, whether it's in the actual garments or whether it's in advertisements. And it really influenced how I wrote my book. So the
Mhm.
book is about how animals are represented in visual culture and what it says about us as beings that consume art, that consume fashion, that consume animals, and
Mm.
also consume the symbols of animals for various purposes. So it's deeply relevant to fashion, especially when you consider how both art and fashion rely on visual storytelling, which not always, but often, more often than not, reduces animals to symbols. Both art and fashion conceal what the reality of who an animal is. We'll often see animals used as these two-dimensional, they're reduced to these two-dimensional symbols. The tiger represents strength, or the bird represents flight, or the horse represents speed or power. Animals are turned into pigments essentially to paint meaning. And
Mm.
we, by doing that, we remove the individual, we remove the inner life, we remove any ability to empathize or relate to an animal in a way that's not just about flattering our own egos.
Interesting, because I feel like maybe women listening will reflect on that as something similar to how women are often used in fashion. Like it's the object of a woman often, even on like prints on clothes
Mhm.
and stuff. It's like the beautiful form as compared to someone with an inner life. And that's so true of animals too, but maybe less thought about. We've come to the part where we've started talking to people outside of ourselves. Love chatting to you, but we're also now chatting to some other people. Each week, we're giving a couple of facts on a fashion industry issue, and then we're asking someone who knows a lot about it to share more, basically. And then we wrap up with our 2 cents. This week, I'm super happy that we had Orsola de Castro to talk to us about how craft and individual creativity in fashion can be a kind of resistance to how mass production intertwines with unsustainable and unethical garment creation, and how it can help to reconnect us to the idea of fashion as art, continuing on the art train, if we start to make more things ourselves or kind of in partnership where a brand makes something but we alter it or we do something as part of repairing and caring
Yeah.
for it for a long time. So if people don't know Orsola, she's the co-founder of Fashion Revolution. She's the author of Loved Clothes Last. She's an internationally recognized leader in sustainable fashion who began as a designer. She's now also creative director at Aesthetica Fashion. I started by asking Orsola, everyday people, we used to sew, we used to knit and mend our clothes, but we've really lost a lot of those skills as a wider collective. So I asked, why do you think that that has happened, and why is it important we fix it? What have we actually lost in the losing of these skills?
This is a brilliant question, probably my favorite. So, we relinquished those skills because we were enslaved by them. And by this, I mean women.
Mm.
So, needles, threads, the humdrum craft of sewing. For us, it was a drudgery. For the majority of women, it was drudgery. But the truth is that when my sisters in the 60s burnt their knitting needles as well as their bras, I get that. I
Mhm.
absolutely get that. And I think this is a question of reappropriation. We need to understand that they were tools, not weapons. We want to organize in a way that is different to the way that men organize. But within those needles, in those hemlines, with those stitches, we said something. We said things to each other. There was intimacy in the act of doing it. And little did we know that it could have become an escape rather than an imprisonment. It could be a solution to a massive problem that we've got. It could be a re-understanding of a vital form of expression that we originated and carried on for millennia. Again, by we, I'm speaking about women, on whom the craft of mending, repairing, making, somehow the responsibility of it fell more. So I hope that we can re-embrace this as something that we can genetically rediscover, and this time use it as a force for good rather than something that somehow is so closely identified with housework.
I asked Orsola how fashion can become more creative, more personal, more artistic through focusing more on making things ourselves and not just buying them. And she said this.
I think it's a massive, massive mistake in communication to frame it as the customer can be as creative or creative with. These are applied arts, crafts, not art. The creativity that comes from designing a piece of clothing or, you know, a sculpture or a pattern, whatever it may be, is not something that customers necessarily want to or should be partaking in. This is about something else completely. This is about respect for your own money. What you've bought, you should make last. Respect for the resources from which that piece of fabric comes from. It is coming from the earth. So wearing clothes is not a creative act. It's a necessary decision that we need to make every single day of our lives. So creativity is very scary to most people. I get very angry when people automatically assume that when I talk about mending, it means that they need to go and learn themselves. I am the world's shittiest mender. Every single piece of clothing of mine that was broken, well, not everyone, some of them I let go and I let break. But it's not about me. It's practical. Something breaks, something is repaired, somebody is paid for that repair. Then you can flower all of the relationship that you want. And I spend an awful lot of time thinking about my creativity and the creativity of the person that mends my clothes, but I'm a creative soul. We don't have to think like that. It broke, it gets mended. Do you want a flower on top of it? Do you want a flowery mending? Go ahead. But what we need to focus is the common sense of having something that you've bought, that therefore you put some value on, it breaks, you have it repaired, you don't buy a new one. But I mean, you know, if I've got a really beautiful dress and it's torn at the seam, I ain't going to be touching that. I go to the expert because it's the skills that matter, and it's the people with those skills that matter even more.
What do you think is the biggest barrier to, if it is this common sense, why are so many fashion brands totally ignoring that common sense and not incentivizing or encouraging or talking about how people, you know, obviously there are some brands, particularly brands that sell more expensive clothes, that do have places that you can take their garments or their accessories to be repaired. But overall, brands have mostly made it that that's not their responsibility. And if someone wants to repair something that they've bought, that's kind of up to them. Why do you think that that's the case, and how can we change that best?
So it is that way because fashion hasn't been about craft for at least 20 to 30 years. The minute the luxury brands cottoned on to cheap production in China, it was at the time, that's where they started to produce their diffusion lines that were going to be the affordable designer fashion that none of us has ever seen and ever owned, because it existed for a nanosecond in time and then whoop, it turned exploitative immediately. An industry that designs itself to exploit, it won't design itself to be repairable, because the whole point is that we should be buying more. And fast fashion and fast luxury are both to be questioned, to be scrutinized, and to be taken into question. This is not a fast fashion issue. This is an entire fashion industry issue. So that's why the model isn't working, because the model is fundamentally patriarchal, exploitative, denies the craft from which it originates from, and effectively it's the equivalent of a rocket trip to Mars. So repair, upcycling, anything that's old is an oxymoron to an industry that wants more, that wants new, and wants us to keep on buying. However, what is interesting is that despite 20 years of massive investments in anything technological, from chemical recycling to blockchain, it is the actual humble act of mending that is reaping most of the rewards right now. We are seeing companies being born, offering mending services, mostly third-party mending services. They really are the real winners of this whole mess. I couldn't be happier, because there was a point. I mean, when my mother and my grandmother and my aunt bought clothes from local artisans, and then, believe it or not, Gucci and Faragamo, that's what they were. They were kind of local Florentine artisans. Of course, there were mending services then. They were implied. You spent money on clothes, somebody repaired them for you. And if not within the store, next door.
I think that we need to. I think the industry needs to do this. And I don't see it as necessarily a concession. I see it as a benefit. There's room to offer things like mending kits, workshops, digital repair guides, and campaigns that valorize customization, that valorize taking care of what you have and making it your own. And I don't think it threatens a brand to invite people into that process. And I think it actually strengthens the relationship. I think a brand that would offer those kinds of things, even if it's a window into the craft, even if it's a way to understand the craft that went into it, even if you're not necessarily going to participate, any of these efforts I think would be valued.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point too. Like, if brands are worrying that they're going to lose out on profits and sales because they've helped someone to repair an existing garment instead of buying a new one. But actually, I think of, my partner wears almost exclusively now nudie denim, and they do free repairs for life. It has meant that when another really old pair of jeans has like totally been worn to death, he's gone back to nudie because he trusts that it's like a for life thing. He likes the kind of culture of it. As you say, it strengthens the relationship with a brand and gives kind of more loyalty to a brand instead of being like, oh, I'm just going to go wherever because it doesn't matter
Yeah.
anyway. Once I've bought this, they don't care about me. They don't care about the garment anymore.
What do you think if someone has never had something repaired before? How do they start?
Well, that's a problem. It's difficult right now because we are looking at something that was endemic and that is close to extinction. So first of all, we need to find and locate before we can bring it back to life. We also really need to be teaching people about quality, because I've seen some pretty bad repairs done from some pretty great companies. For me, mending has to be on every street corner, but it isn't right now. So it does imply a little bit of work. You have to look at your area. You have to do an online search. Where do you find it, etc. You have to look at what they are doing. But this is a knowledge that isn't too far back, neither from our impetus and instincts, nor from the literature that you can find. Chances are your grandma or your mother knows what she's talking about, knows what you're talking about. So it's an interesting place to rediscover, because you can rediscover not just about some clothes that need to be mended, but the story of how it got broken. Keeping and maintaining truly is a revolutionary act. I am saying at the moment that maintaining is campaigning. It requires that little bit of extra time. You might just walk around a town and enter dry cleaners and say, do you do mending? You have to retrace the steps in many ways. And therefore, it's not a frightening journey. It's a very comforting journey, but it's about slow. So it won't be boom, boom. It takes patience, but patience is such a wonderful and underrated quality, that mending is profoundly political as well as environmental. The politicality of mending, for me, is one of the most important assets that we've got in order to reintroduce it into a new society. I hope that Gen Z, who have gone from buying to reselling as fast as they can say orange, I hope that mending will become their next tool to say what they think.
What do we take from this? My 2 cents, I guess, are a couple things. One, the things that I wear and also the things in my home, like chairs and things, the ones that I've personalized myself are normally some of my favorites. Most recent example, I've been getting into silver clay, where it's like 99% silver and then a little bit of cellulose stuff, and you burn it and then it's silver. And I made this silver button and I put it onto an old coat that I haven't really worn that much for a long time, because it's one of those coats that's sort of a dust jacket that doesn't have buttons, which is at a certain point in the weather unhelpful. You need to be able to close it up. And so, you know, having a full large silver button is quite expensive. So it's putting a lot of value into this thing that I hadn't been wearing. But now I am, and I do, because it's much more special to me. I imprinted leaves from a beach that me and my partner love going to on the silver. So it's now way more valuable to me. And I feel really good about being able to do that kind of thing. I think the benefits for us to consider in this whole space is how much more we value our clothes and how much that changes how we consume. And I hope that the way that that might change consumption on the consumer side will have an influence on brands, and that brands will come to realize, like, actually, if we want to have people who love and respect our brand, we need to love and respect the clothes that we make enough to have a commitment to them lifelong, just as we're asking the person who bought them to.
Yeah. You're in your leaf print era, because you got your leaf, you have your leaf tattoo, you have your leaf button.
I just would love
what
a
else do you
leaf.
have?
What about you?
My 2 cents are that I think this really highlights where the difference between fashion and style becomes very clear and very differentiated. And where fashion is about an external system, trends, designers, runways, consumer cycles, style is about the internal expression, how you interpret and wear clothes as a reflection of yourself, how you personalize them, how you interact with them and live in them. And fashion is driven by commerce, it's driven by media, it's driven by seasonal shifts, whereas style is driven by your values, your personality, what you prefer over long periods of time, what you accumulate. And fashion can tell you what to wear, and style tells you who you are.
Mm.
I think that fashion often asks us to consume identity as a receptacle. We've talked about how the term consumer is kind of a problem.
Yes,
That a
citizens
consumer
first.
is passive. Yeah, when you're a consumer, you are just a receptacle consuming. And I think that craft invites us to construct as someone with agency,
Mm,
as a citizen, perhaps,
mm,
as a participant in the system rather than just a consumer. And so I think that that craft it really hones in on being an active participant and not just being a consumer.
We're people, we're creatives, we're holders of style instead of just buyers of clothing. Love that.
Yes. Yeah.
And that brings us to something else I love, greenwash of the month. Shall we discuss? Who wants to go first?
Please, you tell
Okay.
me what you have been washed green by.
Well, we've been talking about vintage and how it's great and how we love it. And we know how good it is for the planet. If every consumer / person / citizen bought just one secondhand garment instead of a new one this year, it would lower carbon emissions by more than 2 billion pounds, equal to taking 76 million cars off the road for a day. That's huge, and that's from ThreadUp report. And this is kind of the context for why I'm really, really annoyed about the greenwash of the month, which is that I've been finding vintage being used as a descriptor of a kind of style or trend rather than what it actually means, which is something made back in the past and normally of a high quality. So, for example, I was looking for a very specific kind of vintage cap online for a gift for someone. And the first 10 things that came up that also were sponsored were from Shein, from Temu, from Active Basics, sold on the iconic Universal Store, heaps of other brands. And they all will say outright that they're vintage, or they'll say vintage wash or vintage look when they're all newly made things. Doesn't that feel
Ugh,
outrageous to you? I think it's so
that is so
irresponsible.
outrageous.
Because
Yeah.
like vintage has more of like soul and spirit, I think. For me, vintage clothing, I like the fact that, someone else wore this vest before me and I don't know who they are. I hope they're well. But it's like interesting. It's a part of it. And that's actually not there. And the environmental and social benefits of buying vintage are being used in order to get people to buy things that don't have those benefits. So,
Yeah, if you were to keyword search vintage, some of
yeah.
these things might come up and you might be misled into thinking that this is actually a vintage piece and not just a vintage aesthetic.
Totally. Like the first whole page of results were not vintage things. And if I hadn't been looking at it with a more kind of critical eye, then I might have just bought a cap made in potentially really awful labor conditions from materials that are not sustainable. And I think my summary on that is you have to put in the hard yards for a vintage look. You can't just buy it and get it. That's kind of the whole point. You wear your clothes to death, you look after them, but the process of decay, I guess, is a part of the aesthetic. Like I have a cap that I got given when I was 14 and it has the NASA symbol on it, bringing back the astronaut thing. I wanted to be an astronaut when I was a kid. And it says, I need my space on it, which is also very true for me still. Anyway, it used to be like a dark khaki and dark purple dual tone thing. And now I've worn it like swimming in the ocean and it's a very different color and patina and look. And I love it. And sometimes people say to me like, oh, I love how the cap has that look. Like, where did you get it? It's like, I got it more than a decade ago. And that's why it looks like this.
It's really upsetting that this is maybe ties back into what we were talking about earlier about how the fashion system, the way that fashion, operates at commercial scale, it has that insatiable appetite for subculture. And I think that vintage is a victim of that now. And so how do we protect that word, Emma? How do we
It should
protect
be,
what's actually vintage?
I mean, I would think that some labeling laws already would take issue with this, but maybe it means that vintage, secondhand, pre-loved, all of these words need to become more strongly legally protected as like it has this specific legal definition, not just generally agreed upon cultural definition, so that if it is newly made and it has vintage, it's much easier to make sure that the person that does that is really legally not allowed to do that because it's a real shame.
Yeah. Wow. I'm going to be extra cautious now. You know what else I
Yes.
noticed? That certain secondhand shops have their own line of new things that they put on the racks among the vintage stuff.
Ew.
As you're looking through for a vintage t-shirt, if you look at the tag, it will say new item. And it'll be their own internal like fast fashion brand that is being like that it's riding the vintage coattails. That's
That's a shame.
that's something I need to investigate more. Yeah, I'd love to look into who's doing that, where it's being made. I'll get back to you on that. I'll do a little detective work. My greenwash of the month is Faragamo's Earth Day collection. And when you see the Earth Day collection website, it is, of course, Faragamo. It's beautiful. It's aesthetic. There's this gorgeous high definition video with mountains and forests and fields and phrases like "it belongs to the earth." And this was launched on Earth Day, and I looked through the collection because I was curious. Okay, are they using exciting next gen materials that are pushing boundaries and solving problems? And no, there's nope. There's things like the Back to Earth hug bag, which
Mm-hmm.
is basically just a calfskin leather bag.
Oh, good.
And calfskin leather, to Emma, would you tell me, is calfskin leather appropriate for like an Earth Day campaign?
No, given it is one of the highest emission materials, requires biodiversity destruction, is inefficient. Also, like, if we're talking about life on Earth, can we maybe use material that doesn't kill life on Earth? I think.
Yeah, yeah. And there's claims that are made in the language when you go to the website. If you click on the product,
Mm-hmm.
um, there's terminology that here I'm opening it up right
I see they're
now.
saying
The
it's
hug,
vegetable tanned leather, and it's like, okay, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's biodegradable. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a massive amount of water in that tanning. It doesn't change the fact that the raw material is inherently unsustainable. It's a bit
yeah.
tiring, isn't it?
When you go to the homepage for this Earth Day collection, there's things that are written like this limited edition features bio-based materials like calfskin leather. So they're using terms like bio-based, which have been used and marketing to communicate a lot of next gen materials that used to be maybe plastic based but are now bio based, but it's being applied to something that it doesn't feel appropriate to apply to calfskin leather, where even if it's vegetable tanned, as you say, it doesn't account for a lot of the scope 3 impacts of calfskin leather.
And that's that natural
So
fallacy. It's technically bio-based, but like it's destroying the biome as well. I see they have a quote, nature heals every
yeah,
wound when she is given her freedom. I feel like that in the context of an animal industrial complex that kills animals for profit is kind of interesting. And
yeah.
anyway,
So much of this collection is just calfskin leather, and to package it as an Earth Day collection feels to me like greenwashing.
it feels that way to me too. How interesting. Well, thanks for chatting. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you.
That's a wrap. See you next time.
We appreciate you. We love you. Subscribe. Leave us a message of encouragement. You can shake a finger at us too if you want, but just do it silently to yourself and not in our comment section.
No, do it. Tell us. Let us know. Bye.
Bye.